Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 22nd of February, and today's video is particularly interesting because of course we're looking at Velyka Novosilka, but we also have a lot of interesting developments around Andriivka along with the Oskil River bridgehead, because now there's another one that is burgeoning, along with new updates about the situation in Sumy Oblast and near the border with Kursk, including in this Velyka region, and also in the location that the Ukrainians tried launching a localized counterattack in 2 weeks ago. So we're going to cover all of that in today's video, along with a potential new EU aid package by the end of today's upload. So please like and subscribe as we get into this video. Over here, you can see in yellow the polygons indicating Russian advances over the past 48 hours. And you can see how there's this very interesting maneuver wherein there are two advances by the Russians aimed at squeezing the Ukrainians out of their strongest positions. The Ukrainians have relatively strong positions northwest of Velyka Novosilka. There are two lines of trenches running along lower elevated locations that are pretty close to the Mokriali River, and these are being manned by the 110th Mechanized Brigade primarily. So the Russians, instead of assaulting them head on, have tried to flank them. First of all, the 5th Tank Brigade, one of the key units involved in the capture of Velyka Novosilka, has since expanded northwards to Novi Komar and has captured in recent days positions, including on the eastern bank of the river, and you can see that with a yellow polygon, and then also in one of the villages that is to the northwest of Novi Komar. So I'm going to click on the square kilometers captured over here, and this is from the past 24 hours. The Russian forces in a column of 10 vehicles were able to advance and capture another 3.5 square kilometers of territory, and the process also took over a local Ukrainian stronghold. So you can see over here 2.3 kilometers northwards, advancing very, very close to the river itself. And here's the video. This is from the 110th Brigade, where they targeted 10 of those vehicles and they claim to have destroyed 9 of them. There's a 5-minute video where they show the entirety of the clashes, including the shelling and FPV strikes, along with the Russian forces that dismounted in these tree lines and near that local stronghold. So now the Russians are making pretty quick inroads along this river that gets them very close to some of the Ukrainian defenses that were built over here. They include mainly anti-tank ditches, and there are 2 layers of them. There's one over here, and then a bit to the north, one of them that is supposed to protect the highway that connects between Bakhatir and Komar, and more generally protects the hinterlands that are in between the line of contact and the border with Dnipro, which from there reaches into Novopavlivka, which is in another story entirely. But you can see the direction this is all going in. At the same time, the entirety of Novochertuvatse has been captured by the Russian side based on recent geolocated footage and reports from the Ukrainian side, meaning that direct access to the next village being Skudnie, a really small hamlet that is isolated from the rest of the Ukrainian garrison in this region. And from there, you have a very similar story wherein there's one paved road that advances along the western riverbank, and there are a couple of hamlets along the road that could be pretty quickly captured if the Russians devote an armored column and a sizable amount of infantry, perhaps a platoon-sized force, to enter into those villages. Because once a village of that size, that is so small, gets entered into, it's very difficult to dislodge a large-scale Russian force. It does happen every now and then, but it usually requires significant attrition from the Ukrainian side or a concentration of drones. And in this particular region, it just continually happened over and over again in the buildup to Velyka Novosilka, where the Russians were able to dismount and then from there expand outwards without being pushed back. And so the goal eventually would be to reach Komar. And at this rate, it could be flanked from both directions. But in terms of the local advances over the past couple of days, the areas that are being attacked are being curated in such a way that leaves the Ukrainians in the center over here in an exposed position that would either encircle them or force them out. So you have right here this sort of outstretched area by 3 kilometers. And from the west, you also have this flank because 1 square kilometer of territory was captured by the 57th Brigade. They're around here somewhere, and they were involved in assaults towards Brulotske being one of the nearby hamlets in this location. And following the capture of Bulutske, you have this large swath of open fields that spans about 5.5 kilometers before you reach the next line of Ukrainian defenses. And that's actually the most serious line of Ukrainian defenses before you arrive at Komar. And also the final significant one that has been constructed in its entirety before you reach the border with Dnipro. So it's so important for the Ukrainians to ensure there is connectivity and to sort of keep the Russians at bay at the front line, because once they lose these sort of forward positions, the Russians will have the advantage of advancing through the higher elevated ridges, because this entire region that has been in between Burlatske, Shevchenko, Vesela, etc., it's all on really high elevation. The Russians are in the process of capturing, and from there they have dominance over the nearby Ukrainian positions upstream and all the areas that are near fortifications built by the Ukrainian side. There's also the concern that I've continued to reiterate, and I'm going to really mention it every single time I talk about Velyka Novosilka, that the Russians could eventually turn west and exploit the gap where there is a lack of fortifications in the area between Dnipro, Zaporozhye, and Donetsk. It's like an 11-kilometer opening over here, sort of diagonally, and it's an area that definitely is exposed. But right now, that's not a main focus for the Russians, because really their objective is to advance along the river and cut off the entirety of southern Donetsk. And that plays a role in why we're seeing them focusing so heavily on Andriivka now that the Ukrainians are in the process of withdrawing entirely from the pocket. And I've been warning about this for a couple of weeks now, about the potential for this sort of collapse. And now we're seeing it unfold in real time. We're seeing, based on reporting from the Ukrainian side, Deep State and Petrenko, that additional swaths of floodplains and open fields have been taken over by the Russian side, including here 3.2 square kilometers, within Ulakli itself 0.8 square kilometers, and then along the Sukhyali River, nearly 1 square kilometer. So luckily in its entirety has been captured. This is based on a video from the 21st of Russian soldiers raising their flags. And in all likelihood, a lot of this region over here that I'm going to scribble over in red has already either been converted into a gray zone or is under Russian control, because it's simply not feasible for a Ukrainian force to remain positioned in an area that is completely open, doesn't even have tree lines, that is in a low elevated region because of the Vovch River. So whatever Ukrainian forces are over here, they have by now probably withdrawn to the northern section of Konstantinopil, where there is still a Ukrainian hub of resistance that is trying to drag out the fighting. And due to the pace of the Russian advances and their need to consolidate, it could take a couple of days for that process to be complete. But then you'll have the full force of the Russian units that were involved in the attack on Andriivka, Ulakli, and Konstantinopil, all concentrated on one direction, which is this small sliver of the northern section of the town. And by that point, it would be impossible for the Ukrainians to remain in this location. And it's largely being held right now by battalions of the 46th Air Assault Brigade. But you also have this situation now where a lot of units that were sort of scrambled across the entirety of the pocket, they had to withdraw at such a fast manner that now there is a lack of cohesion and they don't really know where to go. They haven't been assigned new positions yet. So it's going to be a really important task for the Ukrainian command over here to very quickly get things in order, dedicate certain portions of the front line to certain units, and then build a solid line that could actually hold in the short term between Rozliv all the way northwards to where the Russians are currently projecting power at the western gates of Andriivka. And this region is difficult to hold because the Ukrainians are in really disadvantaged locations elevation wise. First of all, these two lines over here are all river valleys, or Lova or Vovcha river valleys, and these are places where the Ukrainians are heavily situated in. And it also extends into areas like Bakhatir and then Rozliv. There's a really large valley that runs through the entirety of Rozliv. Whereas the Russian forces, obviously, they're getting control now of low elevated regions, but to the north, they are getting either control of, or the gray zone is located on higher elevation. And then sort of the same thing over here with areas that are on either side of the Sukhyali River. They're also on pretty high elevation. So these are locations that I'm circling that are on hills, and a lot of them are currently under Russian control or could fall into their hands in the coming weeks. And this means that the areas that the Ukrainians are going to retreat to and try to build around are going to be at a disadvantaged position and will be fired upon continuously by Russian FPVs, a lot of them now being fiber optic FPVs, and by local mortar crews. So that would include Rozliv, Bakhatir, or Oleksivka. But those are positions that the Russians absolutely cannot take a hold of, because then they will have the momentum to reach the border with Dnipro, and then from there the highway to Novopavlivka, and then also to get control over all of this eastern flank of Komar, which is going to take out that node in its entirety. So it is a situation that the Ukrainians they need to stabilize. In terms of the manpower, they probably do have it now because the front line is shortened, because they're not defending the entirety of a perimeter of a pocket, but it's really a matter of whether they can get their act together in time before the Russians continue to press further. Now, when it comes to the situation in Pokrovsk, you can see over here that the Russians have been able to reverse the results of Ukrainian counterattack in Lysivka and have actually expanded even deeper into the village, deeper than ever before. They captured 2.4 square kilometers of territory here in Lysivka based on the geolocation from the 25th Air Assault Brigade from February 24th of shelling of Russian soldiers in the northern parts of the town. So previously, we knew the Ukrainians were able to conduct a counterattack and the Russians were pushed out of almost all of Lysivka, but it appears that it ran out of steam and the Russians sensed an opportunity and were able to very quickly pounce back and take the majority of the village, whereas the Ukrainians still retain control in the western section of Lysivka and in an area where they did conduct the successful localized counterattack, which allowed them to enter into eastern Dechanska. So for now, that counterattack still has sort of solidified its gains, but the other one that occurred in Lysivka more recently over the past week has been totally reversed, and the Russians took over those 2.4 square kilometers, now giving them the opportunity to fully take over the village and then expand towards the sort of perimeter line, this line of defense that is protecting the entrance to the Pokrovsk sort of hub, the entrance into the entirety of the Pokrovsk environs, because following the capture of Lysivka, you have Sukhyali, you have the anti-tank ditches, and then you have a couple of sort of sparsely situated strongholds. But then you have this open swath of fields that could be very easily penetrated into, and from there you can arrive at southern Mirnorod, you can arrive at rail lines that push deeper, you can reach suburbs like Novopavlivka, Nativka. So it is an area that could be exposed if the current front line obstacles are overrun, because there is an intermediary point that simply is too weak, and also the Ukrainian troop commitments over here aren't that significant in relation to the areas a bit to the west where you do have a pretty large Ukrainian commitment. So it would be important for the Ukrainians to just ensure it doesn't deteriorate into that situation, although I haven't seen indications of that occurring so far. Now, looking really further northwards at Bilohorivka, over here we have confirmation of a full Russian capture of the village. So this is based on two geolocations for the past 2 weeks. And in the process, also, they captured 1.7 square kilometers. So over here, this is from February 11th. Two Russian soldiers that were out in the open were hit by a grenade drop. And this was sort of in the western outskirts of the village. And it was recorded by the Ukrainian side, indicating the Russian control. And then on February 20th, Russian infantry were shelled in forested patches in this area that is extremely close to the Donetsk River. And so that's, again, further elaboration that indicates to us that the Russian forces have taken it over in its entirety. And this is after like 2 years, ever since the Battle of Lysychansk ended. And that was like late spring of 2022. So it's been a really long time at this point, over 2 years, wherein the Russian forces have been battling back and forth in Bilohorivka, and now it's been taken over in its entirety. You have the Ukraine forces now either gathering in Andriivka or in the higher elevated regions a bit to the south, because you have this ridge that sort of looks like this, and it's located entirely to the northeast of Siversk, and it's largely in open fields that are under Ukrainian control, and then sort of extends into Bilohorivka. So now the Russians have gotten a bit of a taste of it because of the capture of the village, but they have to now further capitalize on that to get control over all of these hills south of Prihorivka, and that will give them really good positions to stage their forces to overlook the entirety of the Ukrainian garrison operating in Siversk, because both the trench line to the east of it and the town itself are located in rather low elevation that can be dominated if the Russians get control over this northeastern portion. And that's the benefit of getting control over Bilohorivka. It gives you a direct route to do so. So I would just keep an eye for that to see if the Russians are able to succeed in those sort of maneuvers, and it would sort of rest upon getting control over Prihorivka in the process. Additionally, I want to look at the Oskil riverfront, but not at the regular bridgehead that we've been discussing in detail, the Varechina bridgehead as we refer to it, but actually one further north, because the Russians were able to sense a weak point in the Ukrainian lines that's also very close to the Russian border, meaning that it's pretty good for them logistics-wise, because you have over here the village of Valuki, which is just a organization point, a connecting point for a lot of local roads. So it is a great area to just move logistics to and from. And so opening up a new front or opening up a new attack vector over here is not that difficult for the Russian side, especially given the lack of Ukrainian forces that are devoted to this area. So now they've been able to expand even deeper the Russian forces into Topoli after the initial advances that occurred over the past couple of weeks succeeded and the Russians were able to set foot across the river. Now they've actually expanded into the populated areas. And you can see over here the geolocation from February 22nd. The video released is from the Crazy Cats units, which is a part of the 3rd Tank Brigade. We already saw them recording videos of strikes in the other parts of the bridgehead, the area near the Verichna. So we already knew of their presence, but now it appears they've been redirected, at least partially, to this other bridgehead a bit to the north. And the 3rd Tank Brigade is massive, so it's entirely possible that only certain sections of it are committed to this particular part of the front line, because they have like 3 tank brigades, which is massive. They have, I believe, 3 rifle battalions and then a mechanized battalion. They have a sniper platoon. They have so many different elements in them that is not just related to tanks or infantry fighting vehicles, but also it also includes a lot of infantry soldiers and also drone crews, as we saw with the Crazy Cats units. So they do have a lot of men to spare and to distribute in these sort of locations to make up for gaps in the Ukrainian line. But it's definitely not enough, as we saw with the Dvorizhny bridgehead, because right over here, the Ukrainian commitment is probably around 2,000 men, maybe a bit more at this point. And the Russian forces, they have a larger garrison that is stationed a bit to the east in the Vilshana region that is attacking towards Kupiansk. And so they could just extract men from there and commit them across the river. And so the Russian forces, maybe across the bridgehead, don't have more than the Ukrainians, but they can continually rotate forces. And then that sort of compounds the attrition effects for the Ukrainian side, and they're not able to keep up with the Russian numbers. And so the Ukrainians desperately need reinforcements, not just in Vyrochina at this point, but I also believe in Topoli, because the best thing to do would be to kill this Russian bridgehead in its infancy to prevent it from expanding any deeper, because there is a lot of potential for it to expand, in my opinion, because it is so close to the border with the Russian side, and then also because of some of the dynamics over here. So the entire like Kamyanka Topoli region is on low elevation, and then you have another valley that runs like this all the way to Kamyanka from the north. Everything in between is located on like really high elevation, just massive ridge. And then you have another ridge located a bit to the west of Bilohorivka over here. From there, you have a perfect line of sight towards a pretty significant line of Ukrainian villages that are all connected by this paved road that also could be arrived at through the other bridgehead that is currently situated northwards at Vikholivka over here. You can see at the bottom of the screen. So there could be an opportunity to unite the 2 bridgeheads at a pretty deep location into the area west of the Oskil River in Kharkiv Oblast. And that would just entirely open up this part of the front line and leave the Ukrainians exposed in the rear in an area where they don't have that many men committed. And when we're looking at the bigger picture, the Russians could really entertain this possibility as a way of just exerting more pressure on the Ukrainians and getting more favorable positions in the case of some sort of potential ceasefire negotiation. And a lot of the conversation would then allow the Russians to shift over to the window in the direction of getting control over more parts of Kharkiv Oblast. So that is something to keep in mind with all this. And so I will really keep an eye out for whatever potential Russian advances continue around here. But for now, we just know they have infantry that crossed over the river and are located within the houses themselves, and they're being struck by FPVs by the 3rd Tank Brigade. Now to finish off, I want to look at the Kursk region. There are 2 things that are interesting. First of all, the Ukrainian counterattack that occurred 2 weeks ago, attacking southwards in the direction of Ulyanok. The Ukrainians were never even able to reach it, but at their greatest extent, they were like, what was it, a couple hundred meters away from it. We'll say they were 1.5 kilometers away. Now, even those positions that they were able to take over, including the village of Fanasivka, have been retaken by the Russians. So there's only a very small sliver of land, which amounts to like, what is that? Like 5 square kilometers that they have been able to seize and still retain control over. And it only includes part of one village. So the Russians have been able to take back 3 square kilometers of territory, almost half of the entire possessions captured by the Ukrainians during this counterattack. And we can see that based on 2 videos. So one of them is over here, I believe, February 21st. And they're both from the Alcor drone unit. So the Alcor drone unit from the 116th Brigade has been redirected because previously it was situated in an area a bit to the west near Sverdlikovo. But since then it's been redeployed and it's involved in strikes on Russian infantry. So they conducted those sort of strikes on Russian soldiers that were approaching the tree lines and the lower elevated regions near this pond towards Cherkaskaya, Konopelka. And then over here on the same day, the Russian soldiers actually were able to enter in. They were able to infiltrate into some of the first houses, and they were struck promptly by those FPVs, which gives us an indication that all these positions to the south, including Fanasivka and the forested regions, are no longer under Ukrainian control. It simply was not feasible for the Ukrainians to retain control over here because they were simply too outstretched. And the goal was from a Ukrainian perspective to expand the sort of western flank and then squeeze the Russians out of their outstretched positions over here, located near the Psel River and near all of these forested areas. But the Ukrainians lacked the offensive capacity to succeed in doing so. And so eventually they were able to dig themselves into a hole and were not able to expand in either direction horizontally. And as a result, the Russians took advantage and were able to take out those Ukrainian excess positions. So now the situation is sort of complicated in Cherkasska and Kapelka. There is a battle going on over there. The Ukrainians will look to hold on for as long as possible in order to give time for their garrison and Kolmakov and more generally the Suja suburbs to hold on, because that was the entire point in the first place, to sort of give relief and assurance to the Ukrainians that are defending the southern perimeter of Suja. And so over here you have 116th Brigade, as we said, but also the 82nd Brigade. They're involved in this. They're playing a big role in defending the Ukrainian positions right now. So that's all important to look at. But at the same time, we also have Sverdlikovo. Over here, the Russian forces, and we've talked about this over the past couple of days, have been able to expand and gain control of at least 8 square kilometers. People will wager that it's more than that, but I'm just going with the conservative estimates. And that includes at most a really deep advance of 3 kilometers southwards. And so you have this large chunk of open fields that is located to the south of the Reno and Nizhny Clean, and it's pretty close to the border with Kursk and Sumy. I'll just sort of show you guys the area that I'm referring to. It's still under Ukrainian control on my map, but some have claimed that it's fully under Russian control. And it's located entirely on high elevation. It's a really important position to have control of because it then overlooks the line that supplies Sverdlikovo in the first place. So it overlooks Novenke and then all of the villages that are running along that same valley southwards. So if it's the case that the Russians took it over, then it would give them an amazing position to then infiltrate into Ukrainian territory in Sumy Oblast. And we do know about the continued rumors of the Russians infiltrating into Novenka and Basivka. None of that has been confirmed yet, and I'm being extremely cautious when I refer to these reports. And so I've not changed the maps to indicate it. But if it's actually the case that the Russians have control over the section that I'm hovering over with my mouse, then it would make an attack towards these two villages really a good opportunity for the Russians, and one that I'm sure they would actually end up taking. It would be a means by which to exert a lot of pressure onto the Ukrainian rear, because right now almost the entirety of the Ukrainian shipments are coming from one road. And that's extremely dangerous because we're looking at a large chunk of territory, 450 square kilometers of territory, and tens of thousands of soldiers moving in and out on a daily basis. And it's all being supplied right now by one road. Obviously, you also could just move through the open fields, but it's always preferable to use paved roads, especially during this time of year. And so this road not only is it now in potentially the physical crosshairs because of the Russian movements that are occurring a bit to the north of it. We could actually measure the distance. It's like about 8 kilometers away right now. That's also an issue, but also the FPV strikes that the Russians are conducting. So they have entirely moved to fiber optic FPVs in the Kursk region, and they've been able to spot a lot of the Ukrainian columns that are coming in as reinforcements from Yunikivka to Suja and have struck them along this highway. And it's made the Ukrainian efforts of resupplying and conducting these sort of counterattacks with armored elements very difficult. So this is an area where we're actually beginning to see a sort of parity between the Russian armored losses and the Ukrainian armored losses, because for the most part, the Russians do suffer more armored losses during this like past year, especially. They've been suffering more, just even though as a whole they've gone down recently, because there's been less of a reliance on armored vehicles. It's been shifting towards motorcycles and private vehicles. But regardless, when you look at the proportions, the Russians usually suffer more because they're using them more in offensive activity. But even over here, where the Ukrainians are largely on the defensive, they're suffering similar amounts of vehicular losses due to the Russian strikes on their supply lines that are coming along the R200 road. So that's important to keep in mind. Also, as the Russians were advancing past Sverdlikovo and southwards towards locations that are very close to the border between Russia and Ukraine, as evidenced by this video on February 21st from the 36th Marine Brigade, where they conducted strikes on those Russian soldiers near the border. You had the Ukrainians move in a column of vehicles that was struck. The column was struck as I was approaching the border and approaching the anti-tank ditches on the Kursk side of the border. So there is just a compilation of footage from the Russian side where they're able to destroy various vehicles, including a Finnish Patria Pass APC, a Max Pro, a T64 BV, two PBVs, 302s, those, of course, being the German vehicles, and then also a BMP-1. And so that is a large chunk of equipment damage in that one particular incident. And that also indicates to us that the Ukrainians are trying to conduct stabilization measures to ensure that the Russian forces are not able to get control over Zverlikovo and from there expand southwards into Ukrainian holdings in Sumy, because that is becoming now a palpable concern. And this is all amidst the backdrop of potential talk from the EU of a new mega package, as they're referring to it. They're talking about initially it was discussed of a sort of aid package between 6 to 10 billion euros. That was a number thrown out by the beginning of the week. Now it's been raised to 20 billion euros. That's what they're hoping for the EU countries, and they're hoping to actually expend it even more than 20 billion euros as a sign of support in a way to just give Ukraine this insurance for the next half year, given the fact that there is a lot of instability and a lot of volatility in the relationship with the United States, and the chances of passing another piece of legislation to give Ukraine aid in the Congress, in the United States Congress, is impossible at this point. There's also the presidential drawdown authority that Trump has, which I believe still has like $3 billion or maybe a couple billion more than that. Trump has still not used that. And I haven't seen any talk of him ending up using it. I haven't seen anything about that recently in reporting. But Biden left it for him on the table. So now, in terms of external funding, it's going to have to come from the EU in the short term. And so that's why it's being discussed. And it's being spearheaded by the former Estonian Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, who's also right now the top EU diplomat. And so they're talking about a lot of aid when it comes to 155 millimeter shells. They're looking at air defense systems and then also just missiles for the Ukrainian Air Force. So all of that is being discussed, but right now it's still in the development stages, as it's not going to be passed by the EU itself because there is objection from Hungary, for instance, and perhaps from other countries. And so it's just going to be a pool of donations and contributions from several EU countries that actually are supportive of the initiative. So I'd assume it would include the UK and France, and then also to a lesser degree, but also a big part of it when you add it all up, countries from Eastern Europe. So they would be all involved in this proposal. But at the same time, you have to look and sort of balance out the situation in Europe, because on the one hand, they're trying to dole out now 20 billion euros in aid to the Ukrainians, but then at the same time, they also have to look at stockpiling up their own forces, building up their own soldiers, building up their own locally produced equipment and shells, artillery, all of that, because now there is a lot of concern within Europe of the potential of the United States drawing down and potentially just completely eliminating its presence in Europe, which includes right now 100,000 soldiers and includes a large amount of equipment, and also just sort of this idea of security, this sort of conception of security that acts as a blockage from forcing the Europeans themselves to focus on building up their own security. And so, with that sort of backdrop, it really would force the European countries to look at rapidly expanding their amount of military spending, their defense spending. And so, then the question is, how can that be balanced with like internal spending on defense along with external spending on defense, and stripping away Europe's current stockpiles, which are already pretty low and will not be higher at the current rates of production, and then imagine even whatever has been currently produced then being sent to Ukraine. Then imagine how much more investments will need to be put in order to foot the bill and to sort of close that gap to ensure that at the same time Ukraine is supported, and then you also have European countries building up their own defense industry. So it is a difficult situation for the Ukrainian side and for the European side, I would say. And so they're going to have to look at rapidly and significantly expanding their defense budgets as a percentage of GDP. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.